Hello, everyone. My name's Tom Parker, and I'm a Vice President here at the Australia-China Business Council. I would like to start today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd also like to pay respects to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to our other Indigenous present and from all localities around Australia where our audience might be tuning into. I'm excited to launch the Strategic China Briefing Series for the ACBC for 2022, partnering with Global Victoria through their Trade Alliance project, and to offer members and the wider community the opportunity through leading speakers such as Rowan to gain greater knowledge and understanding of this historical context, current issues, mutual benefits, and the opportunities afforded by our trading relationship with China. And what a way to begin. We have with us today a public speaker, author, and Walkley Award-winning media writer, Rowan Callick. Many of you would know that Rowan is one of the most prominent, well-regarded voices on China, author of 3 books, a foreign correspondent with the Australian Financial Review. Rowan has great insights, and we're delighted that he is going to be starting this series for us today. So over to you, Rowan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. And it's great to be with you. And on behalf of everyone, I'd like to wish Virginia a smooth and swift recovery from COVID. And Tom, great to have you hosting this. You're a renowned stalwart figure in Australia-China relations and now New Zealand-China relations. Or New Zealand-Australia-China relations, all of them. So thanks very much. So at the start of this year, everything seemed on target for Xi Jinping's core goals, with stability at home and abroad, the key setting he especially desired. He was born in a year of the snake, but his career has been dedicated to creating an aura not so much of the snake's quiet cunning as of the tiger's power, strength, and verve. For the Chinese Communist Party above all, but also for himself, seeking to embody the Taoist concept of yang, positive energy. He said during his Tiananmen Square speech for the party centenary last July the 1st, in today's world, if you want to say which political party, which country, and which nation can be confident, then the Communist Party of China, the People's Republic of China, and the Chinese nation have the most reason to be confident. This tiger year of 2022 then, at first appeared an auspicious one for Xi to gain the right results from the sole event that really matters in China, the 20th 5-yearly National Party Congress, probably to be held in early November. He said at a leaders' tea party for the new year that the Congress will be the major event in the political life of the party and the country. Close quotes. The party's core goal is to control its own destiny. It does so within China, and it's increasingly also set on making the wider world adapt to it rather than having to adapt itself to international values, laws, or trends. It's set on making the world safe for itself. In economic terms, Beijing's focus for 2022 was not going to be on growth, as China's steadily sliding growth rate starts to be overtaken by other countries in the region, but on stability. In December 2021, the Politburo stated that it will place the word stability as the top priority for this year. The word appeared 25 times in the report of the Central Economic Work Conference that immediately preceded that Politburo meeting. All China's governance structures were mobilized to promote during this year the 2 chief outcomes required of the Congress, giving Xi a further 5 more years as party general secretary, which due to the lack of eligible successors will probably lead to a further 5, and unanimous party support for the doubtless ambitious platform to cement China's rejuvenation that Xi will deliver in a 2 to 3 hour speech at the Congress. The COVID-constrained year 2021 had ended on a bright note for Xi, who as a result of the pandemic had not travelled out of China for 2.5 years. For the Central Committee of the party passed in November only its third ever key resolution on historical accomplishments, the earlier two confirming Mao and Deng as legendary leaders. This new resolution glorified Xi's socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, thought as a new leap in adapting Marxism to the Chinese context, and stressed Xi's core position in party and nation, having centralized and personalized power. The great Australian sinologist Jeremy Barmay believes this latter thrust provides, however, a real point of vulnerability for the party, with Xi refusing to address who will follow him or how. Barmay says, for people who are concerned about stability, whether it's the stability of the markets, the economy, the real estate market, stability of society, succession issue is of outsized importance. Messianic self-belief that has meant that Xi has reopened the Pandora's box of succession, close quotes. As usual, Xi gave in January a keynote address virtually to the World Economic Forum in Davos. We need to move forward by following the logic of historical progress, he said, adding that the practices of hegemony and bullying run counter to the tide of history. News now to Ukraine. China, he said, is a country that delivers on its promises, close quotes. Since then, Beijing has been hit by triple trouble: economic, pandemic, and geopolitical. And that's what I'm going to go through now. Andrew Batson, formerly with the Wall Street Journal and now the China Research Director, still in Beijing, of what I believe the premier economic analysts of China, Gavkal Dragonomics, has pointed out recently that for decades it was a truism that what China cared about most was getting richer. But at the start of his second term as General Secretary in 2017, Xi announced his priority was to deliver national rejuvenation, a project more explicitly political and economic. At first, Xi's reorientation of priorities was carefully balanced with the needs of economic management. But a year ago, Batson says, emboldened by the apparent success of the 2020 COVID lockdowns, Xi embarked on a fully fledged attempt to deliver on his vision of a restructured economy and society, cracking down on financial risk and the real estate sector, closing down many private education providers, and unleashing the full gamut of government and party agencies to regulate severely. China's most successful and competitive sector, its tech sector. Internet companies' stock prices collapsed and major property developers suffered massive bond defaults. The formerly ubiquitous slogans, dual circulation, meaning a focus on domestic economic circularity while permitting the persistence of less prioritized external connections, and common prosperity, prioritizing redistribution rather than creation of wealth, were then suddenly downplayed, the latter phrase only gaining a single mention in the annual government work report a month ago. During the COVID era, it's been that old driver of economic growth, the manufactured export sector, that Xi only a few weeks ago said he seeks to replace with new drivers, that while comprising a diminished part of the whole economy, has returned to the key role in sustaining growth. Some short-term measures have been applied in an attempt to restabilize the economy, including the PBOC, the central bank, pledging a proactive response to the slowdown, and property tax trials being put on hold, with a meeting chaired by top economic advisor Liu He also saying it would devise measures to support the beleaguered internet platforms. This is all welcomed by the markets, not least because the core problems for the economy had been government policy driven in the first place. Batson believes, however, that this amounts to a change in short-term tactics, not long-term strategy. Singapore-based business analysts IMA Asia anticipate that this year India, Malaysia and Taiwan will exceed China's GDP growth rate, while Vietnam, Indonesia and Australia will be in the same ballpark. it believes it will be hard for China to reach its target of about 5.5%, having only grown 4% in the final quarter of 2021. Beyond the short to medium term, the director of the International Economics Program at the Lowy Institute, Roland Raja, and researcher Elisa Lung criticize analysts who, they say, essentially extrapolate the trend and conclude in the new paper that China will likely experience a substantial long-term growth slowdown due to demographic decline, the limits of capital-intensive growth, and a gradual deceleration in productivity growth. They say even with continued broad-based policy success, our baseline projections suggest annual economic growth will slow to about 3% by 2030 and 2% by 2040, while averaging 2 to 3 overall from now until 2050. China would still become the world's largest economy, but it wouldn't enjoy a meaningful lead over the US, they say, and would remain far less prosperous and productive per person even by mid-century, close quotes. In the meantime, the clearest articulation of Beijing's perception of China's economic position today comprises the annual work report handed down by Premier Li Keqiang a month ago at the opening of the National People's Congress session. He said, in pursuing economic development, China's under the triple pressures of shrinking demand, disrupted supply, and weakening expectations. The recovery of consumption and investment is sluggish. It's getting more difficult to maintain steady growth in exports. The supply of energy resources and raw materials remains inadequate, and imported inflationary pressure has increased. Our capacity to support innovation is lacking in key areas. The budgetary imbalances of some local governments have become more pronounced, and many potential risks are present in the economic and financial sectors, close quotes. The growth target of about 5.5 will require arduous efforts, Lee said, adding that the target for 2022 of urban unemployment is also 5.5%, balance of payments at equilibrium, and CPI up 3. Naturally, he stressed that economic stability is our top priority, with governments at every level required to operate within their means and economize where possible, and fiscal receipts and outlays to be tightened with, quotes, no vanity projects tolerated, and with regulatory powers of government authorities enhanced, including over sectors, quote, sectors with foreign involvement, close quotes. Inevitably, Lee added that we should acquire a deep understanding of the decisive significance of the establishment of both Comrade Xi Jinping's core position on the Party Central Committee and in the party as a whole, and the guiding role of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Last Wednesday, a State Council executive meeting presided over by Premier Li temporarily delayed pension premiums for industries in difficulty and increased unemployment insurance support for job stability and training, and pledging to deploy monetary policy tools. The executive said that the complexity and uncertainties of the environment at home and abroad had exceeded expectations, with the recent outbreak of COVID-19 in China, of Omicron variant of COVID-19 in China, increasing difficulties for market entities and adding further downward pressure on the economy. Now, I've just seen that Premier Li Keqiang has just held a series of meetings with local officials, and he said, we will study and adopt more forceful policy measures as needed. And that may point to further stimulatory efforts, which may be good news for some on this call. Bill Bishop, some of you know, a cynicism guy, says, if that's the case, the floodgates will start opening. Better, more stimulus-induced wasted investment sometime in the future than having the economy go off a cliff between now and the 20th Party Congress. That's a question mark. If there's a shift to more stimulus, he asked, how will it get spent as the country sticks with dynamic clearing and continues to have rolling, partial and full city lockdowns, massive disruption to logistics and transport networks. And if a shift towards much more stimulus is coming, what does that say about the leadership's views about social stability, given how much emphasis they placed in the last few years on the tough battle of preventing and resolving financial risks? That's Bill's view this morning. This brings me to the second major blow hitting Xi's aims for this year, the Omicron variant. After the initial setbacks in Wuhan 2 years ago, when the party was widely blamed for responding too slowly, for keeping information about the pandemic secret and for punishing whistleblowers, the government shifted into full attack mode, and Xi Jinping was recast as the people's leader, winning the people's war against the pathogen. This largely succeeded, and steadily the country re-emerged into comparatively normal economic life, although it's remained largely insulated from the rest of the world, with 14 to 21 days quarantine required for those entering or re-entering. The core policy is zero COVID. No case is acceptable. Cities are closed down with a single case, and people haplessly visiting cities with any cases find themselves required to isolate for a week or more. Many officials have been forced to resign after cases have occurred within their jurisdictions. So reporting of cases, and especially of any resulting or concomitant deaths, has become a highly politicized and fraught issue. The inevitable entry this year of the more contagious but less deadly Omicron variant is testing the zero COVID strategy to the limit. Shanghai has been hit especially seriously, surpassing last week the peak in Wuhan, and is now again severely locked down. With the vast area in Pudong that many council members will recall as the site of the World Expo a dozen years ago, being turned into a huge quarantine encampment. So there have been these grim stories of tiny children separated from parents, of pet dogs beaten to death by health workers, and so on. Streets have emptied. Comparatively modest levels of vaccination, with Chinese vaccines somewhat less effective than the mRNA vaccines, which have not been approved for use in China, and the modest levels of herd immunity are exacerbating the situation. So the promotional progress of Shanghai Party Secretary Li Qiang, a Politburo member who was closely associated with Xi when both were working in Zhejiang, appears to be at an end, I would think. The nationwide economic impact will be material, with supply chains seriously disrupted. Of China's 100 largest cities ranked by GDP, as of last Wednesday, only about a quarter had not imposed new COVID restrictions. The rest, accounting for 53% of China's total GDP, all have comparatively recently introduced forms of lockdown. The economic boost anticipated from tourism during the Qingming holiday a week ago was largely lost, and the understandable risk aversion of both central and local cadres, given the continuing rhetoric from the top about zero COVID, means that the economic impact will persist for weeks or maybe more. As an example, the Tesla factory in Shanghai has been shut for more than a fortnight. The supply chain disruption is also risking the present scattered examples of food shortages becoming more widespread, exacerbating the effect of a poor grain harvest. The Financial Times cited an agricultural advisor to the central government as saying, "We have to adjust the zero COVID policy for farming. We shouldn't prioritize virus control over everything else. This can't carry on forever," close quotes. Now, the third big challenge that's disrupted Xi's hoped-for year of stability is geopolitical, the Ukraine war. As for the problems relating to the economy and to COVID, policy decisions in this area too have exacerbated the negative effects for China. Only a few weeks ago, in their unfortunately timed, rousing 5,000-word no limits joint statement immediately before the Winter Olympics, Xi and the figure he calls my best, most intimate friend, of course, Vladimir Putin, mapped out intensified cooperation, celebrated redistribution of power in the world, and pledged, astonishingly, given the horrific events since then, to counter interference by outside forces in the internal affairs of sovereign countries under any pretext, close quotes. One wonders whether their COVID confinement has not had the effect on both Xi and Putin, already isolated by being surrounded by yes men, as Kevin Rudd has pointed out, of encouraging them to over-egg their ambitions due to their increased solitude. The response of the military and civil populations of Ukraine, the difficulties encountered by the invading force, the cohesion of the West in opposition, and the economic waves washing through the world, including energy shortages and inflation, all comprise further bad news for Beijing. China is not standing in the middle, as some claim. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi underlined this in stressing 10 days after the invasion, the China-Russia relationship is grounded in clear logic of history and driven by strong internal dynamics. Close quotes. Their connection is rock solid, Wang insisted. Xi will not be a peace broker with Putin any more than he was when many expected him to persuade Kim Jong-un to abandon his nuclear weapons program. Nor will Xi use the Ukraine war as a cover for invading Taiwan, as some have suggested. This is not the hour. Beijing will only move on Taiwan when it believes it holds all the appropriate cards in its own hand. And in our region, a new Japanese Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, and new South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol have emerged, who are both staunch supporters of the US alliance and are concerned about China's growing ambitions. The geopolitical challenge has a long time yet to play out. It would be wrong to conclude that despite the extent of Russia and China's shared ambitions and worldviews, including a common influence in Carl Schmitt, the statist philosopher of Germany's National Socialist Party, they align on everything. While Putin's United Russia Party will probably crumble without its leader, the Chinese Communist Party retains massive and sustainable power. Xi, for all his manifest authority, remains a sincerely devout servant of his party and needs to ensure it backs him fully, especially this year. A war, even one halfway across the world, is not helpful for the stability Xi needs for his smooth reappointment, nor is the economic disruption. Unlike the old USSR, China is heavily economically enmeshed internationally and is thus vulnerable. China's currency is not convertible on the capital account and can't become so without Beijing conceding some autonomy that it perceives as a political step too far. It's been the case for a couple of decades. The US dollar remains the global reserve currency. Thus, China remains reliant on the SWIFT network to conduct international transactions, as does Russia, and from which Russia has now been dumped. The preparedness of international corporations like McDonald's and Heineken and Nestle and Uniqlo and Unilever to pull out of Russia or suspend their trading there must be seen by residual realists in the Beijing political inner circle as a troubling precedent. China's NPC Standing Committee passed last June an anti-sanctions law that can be used to punish by blacklisting, banning from financial dealings in China, seizing assets and other measures, individuals, companies or organizations that respond to discriminatory measures against the Chinese party, government or individuals. So those operating in China could, if the geopolitical climate degenerates gravely, have to decide, do we abide by sanctions imposed by the US or other entities, or do we abide by China's countermeasures and refuse to do so? It's all adding a further layer of risk to doing business in China, of course. and sanctions would make it tough for many Chinese firms to keep manufacturing those many goods that require core technologies from elsewhere, including semiconductors, of which Taiwan remains the leading global producer, followed by South Korea. Yu Yongding, one of China's most eminent economists, former PBOC advisor, wrote a few days ago advising capital controls rather than raising interest rates as a response to potential capital flight in the face of geopolitical concerns. He said that if China incurs sanctions similar to those against Russia, its overseas assets face the danger of zeroing, close quotes. He lamented the lag of institutional reform and financial market construction, close quotes, and advised buying more US products and fewer US Treasury bonds. And he warned the danger to China of debt traps in Belt and Road investments. We've heard of the danger of countries that take out such debts, but of course, there's considerable risk to Chinese banks in having given debt to countries that may not be in a position to repay them. Australia's intelligence chief, Andrew Shearer, told a recent financial review conference last month, actually, I think, that until recently, we tended to regard economics and security in sort of two separate lanes, never that the two shall meet. We need to completely reconceptualize that and recognize that they are completely interrelated and interdependent and that one of the best things that business can do to help the national effort in this regard is to help itself, close quotes. He explained this involved ensuring strong cybersecurity and growing healthy, vibrant businesses. There can't be a sort of zero-sum trade-off between economic growth and security, he said. This naturally involves business investing in assessing geopolitical risk rather than expecting government to de-risk for it. The Ukraine situation has underlined also how geopolitical concerns increasingly form part of the ESG, environmental, social and governance framing required these days for commercial success. Leading Australian sinologist John Fitzgerald has written that the Ukraine invasion should also trigger corporate risk calculation concerning a potential Chinese attack on Taiwan. In such an event, he said, quotes, any Australian business dependent on China for supplies or technical inputs or for markets or investments is likely to face customer boycotts, if not international sanctions, that will compel it to exit the market and compete with others in a scrabble for alternatives, close quotes. Ukraine teaches, he said, that those heavily engaged with China, quote, should be planning for the worst while hoping for the best, close quotes. The answer is not to isolate Beijing, Professor Fitzgerald says, but to manage business risks ahead of competitors who have not yet got the message, close quotes. Finally, the advice I'm now hearing, frankly, from people with practical business experience is rather different from former conventional wisdom, which I myself used to offer freely. It's that for now, at least, transactional dealings may be preferred to those requiring long-term on-the-ground research. That it's extremely difficult and possibly also unwise to base yourself as a principal or senior staff in China, especially during this era of zero COVID policy, which appears likely to continue at least until the Party Congress. There are far fewer foreigners now working in China than a decade ago. Even visiting is extremely challenging. On the flip side, areas of promise for business in China continue to include health and aged care, green energy, and COVID-related areas. One suggestion for structuring business opportunities is to pursue them in triangular form, involving a business partner from another country, such as Singapore. sharing and reducing risk. Engagement is no longer the leading template for relating to China, as it sets itself increasingly apart, including economically. Although its application to join the CPTPP trade pact late last year caught many by surprise and merits support as long as it repairs its commercial spats with existing members, including Australia. Every country on earth must find a way to live alongside China, but it's getting more difficult to do so while retaining full sovereignty, since the party believes its security can only ultimately be guaranteed by restraining others' sovereignty. Diplomacy should work, and it shouldn't be this bad, but the past doesn't provide adequate context for the current turn in events. What's happening with China goes way beyond loose lips or protocol, and it's affecting the whole world. It's not an Australian issue. Little change can be expected until after the party Congress, then the ensuing People's Congress next March, when most top jobs will be vacated for more of Xi's team of loyalists. There's zero gain as yet for anyone senior in the Chinese system to be seen to argue on behalf of Australian counterparts, even those they've long known, so they won't. And the Lowy Institute's polling shows why there is no net gain in votes for the Labor Party if it seeks to differentiate itself in its China policy during the present election campaign. So it won't. Of course, everyone on this Zoom event will well understand that during this difficult period, a top priority should be for us all to work that much more conscientiously to maintain our communications with friends and business contacts in China. To an extent, that's what the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations is doing, and I'm a member of its advisory board. It's doing it at a more comprehensive level, supporting those organizations and people engaged in valuable projects and programs traversing the two countries, with the most recent grants round providing $4 million. ACBC received a substantial grant in the previous round. But now's the time, folks, for business to follow Deng Xiaoping's famous 24-character strategy. Observe judiciously, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities, and bide our time. Thank you for listening patiently, and over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Rowan. And I think, yeah, the summation at the end there, build the capacities is a great one. And thank you very much, for a very in-depth and well-structured and incredibly well-researched, thought starter to this series that we're working with Global Vic on. It was remiss of me at the start on 2 points. One, and thank you for mentioning it, Rowan, that our fearless leader and CEO, Virginia, is unwell with COVID, and I am the medical sub, to use a AFL terminology, who's come off the bench at the last minute to replace her. So we wish her well and a speedy recovery. And the second point was, as Zach very kindly pointed out, is that we are taking partly a reduced introduction and formalities, so that we allow enough time to really get into a great Q&A session with Rowan. So if you do have a question for Rowan, please put it in the Q&A box, and then through that, that enables myself to kind of collate and pull those questions so that we can get a great discussion starting. Just while some of the members of this call think up those questions, and perhaps you've covered everything, which I know that sometimes conversations and certainly the topics raised today, both economic and with COVID, and then obviously more on the geopolitical stuff, we'll raise a number of questions. One thing I wanted to just chat upon, and given that I've always found with your work, Rowan, you're incredibly you scour whatever's publicly available in terms of often from a Chinese perspective, it's in plain sight because it's written out in the party, in the memos, in the communiques around congresses and other events. What are you seeing on the environmental or on the sustainable perspective? And one of the things that we're obviously from an ACBC perspective are very keen with our president, David Olsen, to be, referencing a lot around this kind of green channel cooperation between Australia and China. But are you seeing much being written about on sustainability, environmental protection, some of the mitigating issues in that space? Or as you said, with Li Keqiang's recent statement at the Congress that there's a more immediate need, to fix things up, and there isn't such a focus on that.
Thanks, Tom. And yeah, I agree with what you just said. I think this is not in the top 2 or 3 concerns of the government, and that's quite understandable, but it remains an ever-present on the talking points of Chinese leaders. So when Xi Jinping talked to the World Economic Forum, he did indeed talk about climate change and China's leading role, and Li Keqiang in his work report, of course, environmental issues occurred. I mean, there's 2 things to address. One is the rapidity of growth in China, the rapid industrialization has led to residual problems in terms of air, water, and land pollution that it's well understood, and that is a concern with people in many localities, and the government quite rightly appreciates this, and that's remains something fairly high on the list of things that people want their government to sort out, and so they're responding to that and have done. And so here in Australia tends to be climate change as a alternative thing to say, as the environment, climate change, the same. In China, there is that other big priority as well, which the government has been working through, I believe, with some considerable success, actually. In terms of climate change, the government has made commitments, and they're sticking to that. They talk about sticking to those commitments. They haven't got numbers. They haven't committed to net zero by 2050, but they're working towards it. They are still opening coal-fired power stations, but they are cleaner, and they've done a lot of work, and I've written about this in the past, and I visited a clean coal power station in Shanghai, for example, and so so this remains something that Chinese leadership wants to insist that we're actually, in a multilateral sense, we remain leaders. We're going to be leaders. We're going to be present at the right meetings and so on. Although, well, Xi didn't appear in Glasgow himself. As I said, he hasn't left the country for 2.5 years, but it remains important. And my view is that this, therefore, cascades down, and that if people are doing business and their business involves an edge that they've got technologically and whatever other way in terms of clean and green technology products, that remains something important to prioritize in promotion.
Thanks, Rowan. With, I mean, I think certainly the piece that you talked about there of for businesses, and I think certainly government departments as well have been very quick to look at risk assessments when it comes to China, and I think that framework of ESG's just is very good. Although I know John Garner now working in a risk assessment business, so no doubt he's keen to promote that. But one of the things that I was interested in is, given that it's difficult with the quarantine situation, and as you said, the borders are unlikely to open up until after the 20th Party Congress in November or early November when we get a date. What are the opportunities, do you think, for some Victorian service providers in terms of engaging? And obviously, typically for Victoria, one of the largest export was international education, which we're starting to see some students return. But what do you think the opportunities might be for those service industries for Victorian businesses? And given that it's, as you said, risky potentially to put senior staff there, but also it's difficult to engage because we can't travel. What are the sort of medium or short to medium term opportunities do you see, or how best to engage those?
Well, as you say, this has been framed in Victoria very closely around international students, and they are coming back, and some are studying online from China, of course, quite a lot. I don't know what the figures are, but quite a lot are still there. So there's obviously a need for a university sector, which they understand this much better than anyone else, to reinforce the service, I hate to use the word, but product that they're making available, and that the students are treasured and looked after. The extent to which they are varies, I think, and there's certainly improvements can be made in that area. It is very difficult. So if you're talking about services being delivered inside China, there are challenges in delivering new services inside China. You can go to agents, you can contact the Australian chambers in the particularly the big three cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, but and in Chengdu actually. But I think they would offer some practical advice in terms of there being agents or potential partners, and I think that's a logical way to go if you can't go there yourself easily and in a relaxed way move around. And certainly you couldn't do that in Shanghai as we speak, for example. So you'd need to find a partner to work with in China. In terms of doing things here in Australia, it's difficult to invite Chinese guests here. You know, I was talking to the chairman of Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, who was saying that, who himself comes from Shanghai, actually, that there's a very important big figure in music who's Chinese, who has come here quite often, but faces the likelihood of 3 weeks in quarantine once he goes back, and so is reluctant to make the visit this time. That's pretty difficult if you're in a business or in a high pressure job to take that time out. So I think working with agents, working with the Victorian relevant Victorian government agents who provide professional help. Austrade is there, of course, you may have to pay a little bit. But that's where you are. If you think you've got a compelling case, you can still do business. It's not impossible, but it is much harder without the travel tool.
Thanks, Rowan. And certainly, yes, I know Global Victoria and many of our members have had great briefings from the Commissioner Brett Stevens, who's still in Shanghai, and I think at the end of last year, the opening up of the Study Melbourne hub in Shanghai is also a great opportunity. Ron, there's quite a few questions around COVID and lockdown, and I think you really touched on the impact that may have on logistics and other things. What do you think that the theme of the question seems to be either would they go to a model like Hong Kong or Singapore, or do you feel that they'll continue with a zero COVID strategy until the Congress?
Yeah, I think I don't think that'll change. Hong Kong has moved into the zero COVID. It's a particularly sad situation there, with quite a few elderly people have died. We've had this terrible situation we had in Victoria, of course, ourselves a couple of years ago, soon after the start of COVID. And so Hong Kong really has moved into the same strategy as the rest of China, and indeed leading officials who have had a track record of implementing zero COVID have been deployed into Hong Kong to oversee that. So I don't think it's going to change, because that would be quite difficult politically, and the government remains convinced that in health terms as well, this is the best thing. And they have the capacity, which many other governments don't have, to enforce the requirements. So they're going to persist with it, I think. Now, I'm not in a position to say whether they can squeeze out the Omicron variant. There will, of course, be other variants later. You know, people who are epidemiologists, and a friend of mine was working actually for the Americans as a seconded epidemiologist in China until Trump cut the funding, and so she had to leave. Not very good move, but you know, she's explained to me, you know, that gradually you get these increasing number of variants which become more contagious but less deadly, until you end up with a kind of common cold, which is a version of COVID as well. So even if they manage to squeeze out Omicron, there may be another one coming after. So some degree of herd immunity, making sure everyone's vaccinated, is going to be necessary. There's talk of China, by the way, quite soon introducing its own mRNA style vaccine, and I'm sure that will, people say, it will be more effective, and China can get people vaccinated very quickly if it's required. So they'll put a lot of effort into this in the next few months, and so that I would bet that Xi Jinping will want this to be under control, you know, months before the party congress, but then it remains at a economic price, of course, because this whole episode of grappling with it and locking down has an economic price, and also a price in terms of other health issues. We've seen one or two tragic stories emerge on Chinese internet, of course, of people denied access to hospitals with other conditions because the hospitals lockdown for COVID. And it's risky because of that kind of social media messaging will continue to come out at the same time. People are very tired because they've had, like us, over 2 years now, but they felt relieved. They felt things were going well, and they were back out and doing normal things. And one feels terribly for the people of China, having gone through it, a severe lockdown, and then getting back into ordinary life, and now this hitting. It's difficult, politically difficult in health terms.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rowan. A question, again, probably more on the pragmatic side. What do you feel, and I know you sort of talked about, this is the time given from an engagement perspective of keeping up those contacts and those relationships with your partners. But the question I have here is that what's the best way to maintain positive relationships with existing partners or example manufacturers in China, particularly when they're now well informed on the Australian political rhetoric regarding China? Obviously, I guess that's assuming that they're getting a particular view of what our position is, and what might be some ways to maintain that positive relationship?
Well, first of all, I say not a good idea to enter into political debates about political rhetoric. I'd say that's a no-win. That's not win-win. That's lose-lose. And so I wouldn't go there. I'd change the conversation topic, because it's something you're not going to change. And, if you look at the I'm sure most people on this call have been following the Lowy Institute polling figures on public attitudes to China. And, the last one, 76% have a positive view of all the Chinese people they've met, but then all the other figures are extremely negative about the government, about the Chinese government, and so on. So we're not going to get significant change politically in Australia, in my view. So, and probably you or your business are not going to be able to achieve that change. Reflecting, so if you, let's say, I agree with you, you say this to the Chinese side, you're really just fueling, this will keep going, this will keep, that will fuel further. I think better to change the topic and maintain as close links as you can. Phone is always good, speaking, if you can, speaking to people on the phone is always a good way. And talk about future prospects, PC, post-COVID, what can we do together? And you could say, whatever our governments have to say, you and I are doing positive things together. We will continue to do that. It's good for our markets, the people we're providing the service for, whatever. And I think that's the most important thing you can do. And maybe even getting to know people personally by more by phone conversations, because people will be feeling isolated inside China as well right now. So I think that's important.
Absolutely. And if no doubt you're on WeChat, so up your WeChat sticker game, lots of gifts. I always say the 3 Fs, festivals, food, and family. It's an easy way to kind of find that mutual area of inclusivity and to connect in and make it more personal.
Yeah, posting a few photos on the moments that's good. People will enjoy that.
we're just coming to the end, and I've got one or two more questions that I'm just trying to kind of break them down to see if I can get a response for you. All right. Rowan, I'm just going to read if you're okay with this. So this is from Michael up in Shanghai. He sort of saying he's picked up on a line and he's hopefully quoted it correctly from you. And it says, as China sets itself apart economically, he says for the next 1 to 2 years, it's all about supply chains and sovereign states restricting areas of trade and technology. And he's saying that I've watched over several years as the United States has moved to take the lead and manage this area more aggressively, including with allies. And I think we're even seeing that in Australia, of manufacturing more here in Australia. And obviously China's trying to get more self-sufficiency. I think then Michael goes, think critical industries lists outside of Washington are repeated by Australia. China's risk is Europe following this path more aggressively. He's just wanting to see is whether or not what your thought is in this space, and whether or not the USA is playing catch up with China in this space.
I don't know much about America, but good to hear from you, Mike. Michael in Shanghai, I can guess who that is. Yeah. There is a small place. And America remains the center of innovation in the world. I think it's safe to say, particularly in tech. And so that's going to continue, but it's outsourced its manufacturing capacity to China, very substantial, as we know. Quite difficult for the United States to pick that up again. Trump thought he was going to achieve it, but I don't think it's been substantially done. But people are talking generally about cutting down the physical supply chain length, which is a odd thing. People didn't used to talk about that. And certainly in our election campaign here, we have already seen the Labor Party talking about enhancing our returning to a greater manufacturing capacity. So this is quite common in all countries. People have, it's good. You appear to be offering more jobs in that respect. Whether this is going to change things a lot, I'm not really sure the rhetoric's going to change things. But China's got, there's two things happening. One is China's been the assembly point for products from all sorts of places, something from Malaysia, something from Korea, and so on, and then it's put together there. Finding that the type of clustering that's worked very well for China in other places, people talk about Vietnam or Indonesia, is going to be quite difficult. So I don't think we're going to rapidly see a kind of demanufacturing or a rush of manufacturers. Of course, some Chinese manufacturers have offloaded to one or two other countries which have cheaper labor. And that's going to continue, but I'm not sure whether the rhetoric is going to lead to very rapid change here. But the members of the public love the idea of buying something made, made locally. There are limits, but I think the health products is a classic. People thought, I want a mask made in Australia or something like that. If you're Chinese, the same sort of view applies. And certainly the Chinese government, with this dual circulation, is articulating this, and she has wanted to boost this interior circulation, more dependent on, so that the economy becomes more reliant on local consumption and local production, rather than on exports, which is a point of potential vulnerability. But the economy remains fully, hugely internationally enmeshed, and he's not going to pull that away at all, because that's also going to lead such an unraveling.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rowan. And we've run out of time, and I would love, another hour of questions, because you're like that DJ at a party that everyone can throw a request and you're able to satisfy. But also, I think, and I've said this before, but often with China, people who write extensively on China are reading the tea leaves. You not only look inside the teapot, you obviously go behind the counter and ask what sort of tea it is. So we all know, are grateful for your depth of knowledge and the incredible research that you've provided for today's session. As I mentioned, today's session is part of a series of online workshops that we're running as part of Global Victoria's Trade Alliance program, and we thank Jason Fitz, who's on the call, and Global Victoria for the support for this initiative. Our next export session will be looking at market diversification, and our strategic China briefing will have and be focused on sustainable architecture with the design pioneer in the Australia-China space, Dylan Brady, many people who would know, and I think Dylan might be on the call as well today. And Dylan's the architect, and I'm sorry if I've got the name wrong, but SCG0+, a project commissioned by the Shanghai Construction Group that will become China's highest rated sustainability building and its first 5.0 building, which Dylan and his group have also built a number of buildings across China and in Australia as well. Don't forget that we've got the Agribusiness Summit coming up on the 6th of May, and no doubt if you are an ACBC member, you'll see that panel, and it's an incredible lineup, which I'm excited to be going to attend, but also can be done hybridly. If you're not already a member, we encourage you to join to make the most of all we have to offer. You'll notice that there'll be a short survey to pop up on your screen as we close the webinar, and we would really appreciate you completing this, because as always, we're here to serve the people and to serve you, and so that information helps us structure future sessions. In the meantime, I hope you stay safe and well and have a great Easter, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much to Rowan and to everyone today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.